Today tastes like a new tradition, like an old favorite. Tastes like all hands on deck and all eyes on the prize. Today tastes like a piece of the action. And it never tasted this good. The day the world stopped was the day we found where to go. From now on, we are not going to leave anything on our plates, because we've learned to savor the moments that were always there, and they never tasted this good.
Good morning, I am Daniel Chibuye with the American Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to the 2022 Economic Outlook Panel discussion. We wish to thank our gold sponsors, Coca-Cola and PwC, for hosting this event and making it possible. We thank Latitude 15 Hotel also for opening up their premises to allow this event to take place. Enjoy the rest of the video. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this panel discussion that has been organized by the American Chamber of Commerce here in Lusaka, Zambia. We are in a brand new year, 2022, and per Amcham tradition, we're very delighted to have a conversation on what the year will look like. So what's the economic outlook for 2022? My name is Humphrey Mulenga, Managing Partner at Deloitte. And to help us unpack this very important topic, I'm joined by three panelists. Starting off with Andrew Chibuye at the far right. Andrew is Country Managing Partner at PwC. He's a fellow of our institute here, Zika, but also a fellow of the SECA. He holds a master's degree from Manchester Business School, and he has many years' experience in providing audit and assurance services. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Next to Andrew is Bernadette Zulu from the Policy Monitoring and Research Center, the public think tank. Bernadette is actually currently pursuing a PhD. She has served on or in various units at the African Union, but also sits on various boards within government. Welcome, Bernadette.
Thank you very much.
And lastly, but not the least, just next to me is Dr. Austin Mwape. He is a former deputy governor at the Bank of Zambia, where he spent just short of 30 years, actually, in very senior positions in various portfolio there, central bank. He's also the current chairperson at ABSA, a preeminent bank locally here. Before then, he was a chairperson of the board at Stanbic, and he holds a PhD from the University of London. Welcome, Dr. Mwape.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Yes, so maybe to set the scene and just to kick off, what I propose to do for us to just do a quick, have a quick discussion on the macroeconomic, environment at a very high level. So touching on how this panned out, the indicators panned out last year in 2021, and maybe using that as a linchpin to see how that might pan out in the coming year. So if I kick off with, say, GDP, Andrew, many pundits projected that last year was going to be a year of recovery for the Zambian economy. And actually, if you look at 2020, GDP shrunk by 4%. In 2021, according to the Minister of Finance in the budget speech, he thinks there'll be a recovery of about 3.3%.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on how we performed from a GDP perspective last year?
So obviously the GDP was challenged, obviously coming from a contraction in the previous years, fairly slow growth and activity for various reasons, the pandemic obviously exacerbated Zambia's already existing economic challenges. Those challenges largely driven by the debt situation, fiscal deficit, and a few other factors that obviously came together to form a fairly challenging cocktail of factors. So the year itself, I think, is almost split into two if you look at what was there. I mean, underpinning the sort of a number of people actually think the economy would have actually performed a lot worse than it did, because most countries, when they experience a sovereign default like we did, you often see an economy fall off the cliff. That did happen in our case, and that was something which was actually quite heartwarming and pleasant, despite the challenges that we had. And there's obviously the price of copper that was fairly elevated throughout the year. The deterioration of the currency obviously did have an impact, but when you think about that then providing additional support to the treasury in terms of those flows coming through in foreign currency, those are obviously positives. You then see a situation where, especially post-election, I think election is also a factor that plays into the dynamics of any particular country. If you think about uncertainty, there are various decision makers who would say, look, wait and see what happens. Post-elections will then start to move when we know the direction in which the country is going. So you then see, and I think looking at some of the statistics, that post-elections, once we were clear where we were going, you start to see an acceleration of economic activity. I think the statistics show that in Q3, GDP was actually fairly strong in terms of coming back. Some of the statistics, like the Purchasing Managers Index, which shows the level of activity that corporate entities are actually undertaking, actually was in the positive sort of territory. So I think, all in all, not too bad an outcome given the circumstances. The challenges are still there. And obviously, there's a question about whether that growth rate is sufficient to have a tangible impact on the common man on the street. So I think that's the story really of where we're coming from a GDP and economic growth perspective.
Right, fantastic. So 3.3% is an outturn probably for 2021. For this current year, the minister projects 3.5%, I think, in the budget speech. Yeah. What's your perspective there, coming off the back of the 3.3%?
So we actually think it's a bit conservative. Yeah. Obviously, in the context of you don't just look at GDP in the context of the country on its own. Right? We operate in a global environment. Globally, GDP estimates are not too far away from that. Some predict 4.2%, depending on where you look. Some even slightly lower in terms of the various entities that look at that. So when you look at the 3.5%, given the countries in fairly advanced process around things like the IMF conversation, given we expect that there will be discussions and unbundling of the issues around the debt situation, those are potential positives and upsides. There's still downsides. For example, the current budget has put through quite a significant number of concessions for different sectors in the economy, which will take a bit of time before those are recouped and then starts to add to real economic growth. So there are trade-offs on both sides. Our view is that it's slightly conservative, especially, there's one unknown. There's a big unknown around the debt situation. We think once that is unpacked and resolved, then we can have a bit more confidence about exactly where we're going. But we would expect a slightly more positive outcome.
Okay. So that's GDP. Thanks, Andrew. The next macroeconomic indicator I'd like us to touch on briefly is inflation, and maybe I'll turn to Bernadette. So inflation really went what you could call out of control, I think, at some point, touching 24% or almost in the middle of last year. It since then came down to about 16.4% at the end of December. Do you think this is sustainable? Is this a good sign, Bernadette?
Well, first of all, to look at the macroeconomic situation starting from January 2021, especially in view of the COVID-19 brought about challenges, I would say that that's a good indicator that we actually ended up with 16.4% at the end of 2021. In there, we also look at the challenges of the currency itself, and also how our kwacha began to appreciate, and we see this starting there about around August 2021, going all the way to December, and now we're coming to a place of nearly stable in the past few months. Yeah. So if we are going to go on the same trajectory, then we're going to maintain that Zambia is at the right track in terms of rebuilding the economy and also getting back on the recovery road for many instances. So if I may also talk about the inflation globally.
Yes.
I was looking at the report by Patricia Lagarde.
Right, yes.
The president for European Union Central Bank and formerly executive director for IMF.
That's correct.
And she was saying the same things that we're talking about and what Andrew highlighted to say. Inflation is actually troubling many economies world over, including big economies such as the US, of course, the Big Five as well. Yeah. So domesticating it, coming to Zambia, really, I think we are on the right trajectory. If we're going to play around, even from the central bank point of view, I'm interested to hear from Dr. Austin as well,
yes.
To see how the central bank's role in making sure that we are on the same path and actually getting better in terms of inflation. And also, there's some kind of confidence that has been drawn from the new, perhaps, administration, government administration, in terms of looking at microeconomic issues by bringing a new team altogether at the central bank. So we're excited to see what pans out for the country, and especially in relation to sorting out a few macroeconomic issues with relations to inflation and also the issue of unemployment.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Bernadette. That's excellent. And I think that nicely leads us to Dr. Mwape. And maybe let's pick up on the exchange rates, which Bernadette alluded to. So that was on a roller coaster, really, through 2021, one could say. It hit 22.6% in the middle part of the year, then came right down to something like just under 15%, maybe just under 15 kwacha to the dollar, that is. So it's 22.6% middle, 22.6 to the dollar at the middle of the year. Came down to 15.8 around about the August time to the dollar, and then again depreciated to about 17 towards the end of the year to the dollar. So really a roller coaster. What do you think drove that, Dr. Mwape?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think as you correctly said, the exchange rate was more or less on a roller coaster, and we had two significant experiences. If you look at the earlier part of the year, the kwacha was actually one of the worst performing currencies in the world, and towards the end of the year, the last quarter, it is now one of the best performing currencies.
That's correct.
Yeah. The elections were a key factor in terms of instilling confidence in the country, and then of course there were some other factors that impacted on the direction that the exchange rate is going, because sentiments are key.
Yes.
And once the sentiments are positive in the economy, they do tend to influence the demand factor. Then, of course, if you look at the when the exchange rate started appreciating, there are other things which started happening. For example, if you look at the foreign exchange deposit holdings of commercial banks, the commercial banks started actually moving out of foreign exchange deposits and moving into kwacha.
Right.
That had positive implications on the supply side. The central bank was also offloading some dollars onto the market.
Mm-hmm.
So the influences that will impact the exchange rate are so many. If you look at the agreement itself between the IMF, the staff level agreement on the ECF, that also brought in sentiments which meant that the outlook in terms of the economic performance would be very, very, very positive.
No, you're quite right. So you're talking about the exchange rate and the interaction with the IMF arrangement, 1.4 billion financing that has just been sealed at staff level. Yeah,
the outlook is of course positive, because once we secure that, the expectation that money comes in, definitely we are going to see a huge positive impact on the exchange rate. So to me, the outlook is positive. I don't see the exchange rate going any other way other than appreciating, and we should expect it to fare around the 15. I mean, roughly around the 16, 17, 16 kwacha to a dollar over the coming year.
All right. Okay. No, fantastic. No, thanks very much, Dr. for those thoughts. And maybe I can come back to Andrew, picking up on what Dr. Mwape has just outlined, and also what you mentioned, I think, briefly. So towards the end of last year, the government made a big announcement with regards to the IMF staff level agreement, for the $1.4 billion financing arrangement. Now, there are some positives, which I think Dr. Mwape has alluded to, but there's a scope of thought that maybe this should be a cause of concern. If you look at our experience with IMF in past years, what's your view on this IMF arrangement, Andrew?
So I've got a number of different perspectives, and I think it's important that everyone makes their own judgments, right? But I'll give you my view. So the situation at the moment, in as far as I'm concerned, is critical when it comes to the ability of the country to service debt, right? We're already not servicing debt.
Yeah.
We've got significant debt due in 2022 in the form of the first Euro bond, $750 million. When I put it into context, previously we had a challenge with servicing debt because the debt service, the government payroll, we're getting to, and I think the statistics show that we will be in excess of 100% of domestic revenue collected.
Correct.
Then I said to myself, if that's the case, and that is before the bullet or the principal is repaid, so we're just dealing with normal interest repayments, and the situation is already that critical.
Right.
And you get to a point where we have, in a few months, a payment that is due. What exactly is the plan, or what would the alternative be other than a restructure? I think the answer is fairly clear that there's little to no alternative. A restructure must happen. However, for a restructure to happen, in the situation where credibility has been lost, we've defaulted.
Yes.
So the credibility is minimal.
Yeah.
The people on the other side of the negotiation table need some assurances that even if we restructure, we will deliver what we committed to.
Right.
That assurance we can't provide on our own. If you've defaulted, the only way you yourself provide that assurance is if you repay.
Yeah.
Right? The IMF helps to provide that assurance that they will give some sort of security to those who we owe, that will deliver on what we commit to going forward. So that for me is a clear conversation. All right, what are the alternatives? Can we raise resources internally? I think they are very difficult. It's very difficult to fathom how that can happen in the time that's available, because already, on the context that already when we were paying just the interest and other amounts, the country was extremely constrained.
Right.
So you then come to a situation where we have to do this. All right. It's almost as though you have a child who you want to introduce to another family. Say, please accept this person, but the child has got a terrible reputation. All right. Maybe not the best example, but then you bring Dr. Mwape as a powerful Chibuye to say, I'm guaranteeing that I'll ensure that this person behaves going forward. And based on the credibility and goodwill of your Chibuye, the person who has taken you there, you don't get given what you are asking for.
Yeah.
Marriage in that example, in this case, a debt restructure. They say, okay, so what does this mean?
Right.
IMF comes with conditionalities. What are those conditionalities? Yes, the experience has been bad. And one, we still want to see what the full extent of the conditions will be. I think that's a fair comment. That will come out in due course. Mm-hmm. There's still conversations which are happening. So in due course, they will become apparent. Mm-hmm. Number two, if you look at the structure of the current budget, you see expansion in social spending, which has often been one of the places where the IMF targets in terms of cutting. They would cut indiscriminately.
That's correct.
In this case, everyone can make their own judgment based on the budget. Obviously, the budget needs to be implemented, but based on the budget that you see, can you see that there is indiscriminate cutting? In my assessment, the answer is no.
Yeah.
It's a case in point. Look at what's happening with the CDF. Look at the intention to actually raise the government payroll by virtue of hiring 40,000 employees between the health sector and the education sector.
Right.
And we have assurance that this budget, at least in its framework, has been done in consultation with the IMF. They are aware of its contents. We will not have surprises where they say, no, the 30,000 teachers you hired, can you lay them off? So on that perspective, I think, and we've heard as well, the IMF itself say that they have evolved in terms of their thinking. It's more of a partnership. Right. So yes, there will be pain. Yes, there will be sacrifices that need to be made, but those sacrifices, in my mind, are inevitable. You have to do that. If you are in a situation where your finances are in disarray, you have to cut back in certain areas for you to then meet your commitments, which you can't avoid. Yeah. So I think there's obviously nobody enjoys encountering pain. The question which will then go back is how quickly can relief be passed back once we start to bring things under control. Right. So in a nutshell, IMF I think is essential. I don't see what the alternative would be. I hear I hear some opposition to it. Right. But the fundamental question is, okay, if you take the IMF out of the equation, which anyone can do, nobody forces you to go there. Right. How then do we deal with the debt that we're struggling to pay, and how do we deal with the $750 million specifically? Yeah. What is the alternative plan? I haven't heard.
Right. Excellent. Before I come to Bernadette, maybe you can just pick up on what Andrew just alluded to, Dr. Mark. IMF. Other than the IMF startup agreement, we also received a 1.3 billion SDR in August last year, which was a good shot in the arm. And what government has said is they intend to use that 1.3 billion, or a portion of it, to finance the payroll cost for the 40,000 teachers and health workers. Is that a good move, do you think, or is that a cause for concern, given the recurrent nature of payroll costs?
Well, I think the government has thought around that. I know it looks like it's a bullet point, and the concern is how sustainable is it. Right. But there are other attendant things happening. The fiscal space of government is being released. For example, the removal of subsidies on fuel, as well as on electricity tariffs, is releasing about, the government was spending about $60 million a month on fuel subsidies, about 40 plus minus $1 million on electricity tariffs.
Yes.
If you add that up in a year, that's about $1.3 billion.
Big number.
That is being released. So I don't think that there is concern, because it depends on how the extra fiscal space the government has will be managed. The challenge that we've had in the country is not necessarily the unavailability of resources to deal with these issues,
Right.
but the management of those resources.
Right.
How smart have we managed them?
Yeah.
So for me, it is a sustainable thing. There is a space which is being released elsewhere, which can be leveraged to cater for that extra expenditure which is coming online.
Right. Very good. Before we move to the real economy, let's just touch on subsidies, which you've alluded to, Dr. Mwape. And I'll turn to Bernadette. So fuel prices went up by quite a bit, almost 30% for diesel, and I think 20% for petrol. Is that a good initiative, do you think? And then what do you think will be the impact on the wider economy?
Well, there are merits and demerits of removing subsidies in an economy such as Zambia, and looking at the scope of how our people are and where we are at in terms of the human development and individual economics before we can even come to the national scale. To answer your question, Daniel, really, on the merit side, in the long run, the cutoff or the removing of subsidies is going to work for our economy in our quest to recover our economy, or in our quest to grow our economy massively so that it can work for everyone. But looking at the demerits at the moment, the disadvantages at the moment, obviously it is a blow to local businesses, it is a blow to SMEs, and those who are just starting out,
Right.
because cost of doing business are gone. And this has an impact in the short run on GDP. We saw, obviously, last year, if I can just go back to GDP, where Andrew touched, in the beginning of the year, due to COVID, there was some slowness of growth, about 0.5% growth in GDP. By the time it was second quarter, we saw it come to about 8%.
That's
8
correct.
point something percent.
In the third quarter, I think we did 8%, that's right.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, and then that was attributed mostly and largely from the participation of small and medium enterprises. But then if we come, this is what PMRC research, by the way, tells us.
Right.
And then if we come back to subsidies now and the way the fuel has hiked, and before we can even talk about electricity tariffs, then I think that is going to negatively or adversely impact the economy today, small economies within our small scale, or rather SMEs, small scale enterprises, and small to medium scale.
Yeah.
Now, like I already said, in the long run, we are going to see how the monies that have been taken from these sectors being channeled to more productive sectors,
Right.
perhaps,
Right.
improving and increasing benefits in terms of maybe agricultural inputs given out to farmers, and maybe through the already existing initiatives such as FISP and other productive areas, perhaps as artisanal miners, where we're trying to get more activities being done in communities, and the coming of CDF, of course. Well, it has always been there, but the increase, the moving of much more bigger chunks resources or financial resources from the central government going into a cushion, so that our local businesses should not feel this heat that has come with the removal of subsidies.
Right.
Perhaps if we look at it in that light.
Yeah. So funds being channeled away from subsidizing consumption to more productive sectors.
That's right.
Thanks, Bernadette. Andrew, linked to this point on fuel, that just come to my mind is Ndeni, which you can't really avoid. The government has announced plans to, I think they're calling it a restructure and maybe repurpose the company.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this initiative?
So obviously it's a complicated situation because and it's an emotive one, right? For obvious reasons, right? It's one of Zambia's entities operating in a fairly strategic industry, and so there are arguments on both sides of the equation. And again, obviously just discussing based on what's in the public domain, you have a conversation around for it to operate as effectively as it should from a refining point of view. It needs significant investment,
right,
or repurposing for it to do what it needs to do. On the other side of the equation, obviously, is two things. There's obviously the potential for the uncertainty that's affecting those who work there, and then number two is how the feeling of how do you leave such a strategic industry indeed almost 100% controlled by the private sector without the government having a fairly significant say in it in terms of its ongoing and relative to what would have happened, what's been happening given their role owning in Delhi as a state-owned enterprise.
Right.
I think it's, at least it goes without saying that there were conversations to try and get a strategic equity partner for Delhi a few years ago, which were in the public domain, and I'm sure those options would still be on the table. Mm-hmm. So I think in the short to medium term, the solution around the private sector dealing with the importation of petroleum products at the cost of denning, obviously, is something that seems to have been thought through, and is the direction that we're going in. On the other side of the equation is in the long term, can you actually have a situation where you are entirely dependent on the private sector in such a strategic and fundamental industry, which may mean that in due time, I mean, you've got a pipeline there, right? It's already there. That infrastructure is already there. That's something that most countries who would be in our situation would dream of. I mean, there's talk of other pipelines and other opportunities. What it would take to get it repurposed to do other things in terms of the type of crude that would be required. Obviously, we don't have all the details, but you already have the infrastructure there.
Right.
So the trade-offs, do you simply let it go to waste, or in time do you find a way of making it viable again, even if that means perhaps you release some of that ownership to a more strategic partner and independent person who then can come on board. So I think in the short to medium term, it's probably unavoidable, especially because, I mean, they haven't been producing because the government hasn't been able to procure the crude in the first place. Right. So some of these questions actually answer themselves.
That's right.
So if you can't buy even the crude to be separated, to be used in Delhi, and you haven't been able to for a few months, then what options do you have? Right. You have to make some arrangements in the short term. But then when you start to look long term, I think there is a role for that sort of entity. Obviously, notwithstanding that it needs significant investment.
Right. Let's now move to the real economy, and I'll kick off with mining, which is obviously very important for our country. And maybe I'll turn to Dr. Mwape here. Mining, many would argue, has performed suboptimally over the years for a whole host of reasons. The Minister of Finance, in particular, has made announcements to try and grow the copper output from the current 800,000 metric tons per annum to 3 million in 10 years. What's your view on this? Is that a bold initiative or a pipe dream, Dr. Mwape?
Well, it's not really a pipe dream, and I think there are some pronouncements in the current year's budget that the minister made, which will have an impact on the ability of the mines, because the key challenge has been having enough investments to increase output.
Right.
There is a key incentive has been the deductibility of royalties from corporate income tax, and some estimates indicate that that alone will entice about $2 billion in 2022 to be reinvested in the mines. Mm-hmm. So in the long term, because in terms of our reserves, we do have enough ore there, mm-hmm. and with that kind of incentives, we do expect enhanced activity in the mines. We expect a bit more investments to come in. Mm-hmm. So definitely we do see production going up. In terms of attaining the 800 to 1 million tons per year, mm-hmm. I think that's reachable, because already we've mined near 800 tons per year in the past.
Correct.
So I feel that is a meaningful incentive, which should see us make traction in terms of mining production.
Yeah, right. Okay, very good. Still with mining, Bernadette, Dr. Mwape has made reference to mineral royalty tax, which is now deductible for tax purposes. What's your view? Is that a good incentive, do you think, to spur growth in mining?
Certainly, Daniel. That's a good initiative, as it gives us, it grows our revenue base. Anything that will grow our revenue base for our country, that's a good thing. But also, not to forget that within that deductibles, the new policy that was pronounced together with these deductibles during the budget presentation was the non-deductibles or non-deductibility on extraction. And so I feel, or rather we feel, that this gives chance also to our SMEs. I think for me, the economy should work for our small and medium enterprises, because when you have a solid entrepreneurship base in the country, then government can even bow to the entrepreneurship base, because and that's what we need. We are having a kind of economy where government calls the shots, but in very lucrative economies, you find that it is the entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurs that actually drive the economy. And so we need to get from where entrepreneurs are behind government or at the mercies of government. We need to get to a place where government is at the mercies of the entrepreneurs, so that we can see growth in all sectors. And this comes about in huge and deliberate intentional investment in our local entrepreneurs or local enterprises. And for me, I think that's a very good move, that there's now that non-deductibility on extracts in our mining system. And coming back to the mining regime, we hope that even with ZRA, we hope that they can actually be a stronger mechanism than the one that was introduced in the recent past, about 5 years ago, thereabouts, in ways of making sure that the foreign investors in the mining sector are really, really being honest in terms of paying their taxes. And this honesty can only come about with strong systems. If we can only enact strong systems of the country through different agencies and various agencies, online agencies, inclusive of ZRA. So in that light, then we can move away only from concentrating on getting our proceeds from copper. We can now also go to, we have so many minerals. And these minerals, people are just covering them up. People are getting rich. Our monies are going outside the country in a manner that it's actually happening right in front of our eyes. So, and the country coffers is losing out. Most of these challenges that we have, if we could only strengthen our systems to oversee how we tax our mining sector, then that way I think we would make strides and have a lot more to gain through revenue collection.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Bernadette, and maybe Andrew, just to move up. So Bernadette raises some important points there around this perception that some dishonesty happening in the mining sector in terms of deferring taxes. But obviously also they need to strengthen the authority, that is the ZRA. What's your perspective here? What's the right balance there?
Yeah, so the challenge that I perceive in the mining sector, let's put this into context, right? Since about 2010, I believe, we've had 20 major changes to the mining tax code. 20, right? Some count higher, depending, right? Yeah. So the question, when you look at highly capital intensive, long term, how does a mining firm, right, or how does an investor in the mining sector, irrespective of whether they are foreign or local, how do you plan when there's so much change? Okay. Stability is important. The challenge that I perceive is that we have, so there's a perception obviously that there's non-compliance, and the way that we've dealt with it in the past is to try and change the laws to target the non-compliant, and in the end you affect the entire sector.
Right.
Because we have to ask ourselves the question, is it possible that every single player in that sector is non-compliant?
Right.
I think the answer is no. Right. They have to be there are some there. Like every sector, there's good eggs.
Right.
That's our perception.
Right.
They say, okay, so what exactly do you do? And we've been asking this question recently. Right. So if you think about banks, they have the Bank of Zambia. You think about insurance, they have the PIA. Telecoms, yes, as regulators.
Right.
I've got ZICTA. Petroleum and OMCs have got ERB.
That's correct.
Who regulates the mines? Who regulates the mines? It's an open question, right? So it's largely within the ministry. The ministry's got a lot of things that they have got to do, all the way from policy through to implementation. So we think there is some middle ground there in terms of enhancing that capacity. What the mines do must be checked. So we start by, let's have good policy, good laws and regulations, easy for everyone to comply with, that give both the country its fair share from the minerals, as well as give the investor a fair return. Let's put that there. And let's make sure that those laws are not just competitive, but they're stable as well. And then let's come then and isolate where there's no compliance and deal with it through effective supervision.
In a targeted fashion.
So that you then don't end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which has been what the case. This is what the case has been. If you look at the issue of the mineral royalties and what that aims to achieve, yes, increasing the take from the mining sector, but it's Zambia is the only major mining jurisdiction where that was happening. So how does that incentivize investment? How does that incentivize exploration? It doesn't. That's the long and short of it. You look at exploration in Zambia, it's basically non-existent. It's not happening. And if you're not having exploration, it means you're not able to enhance your mineral resource and reserve. You can't do that. You won't achieve the 3 million tons in 10 years. So being very deliberate about how we do that. On the other side, though, is the mining houses themselves. The degree of transparency, I think is important. The degree of social investment, I think, also makes a very big difference when we're able to see the totality of that contribution to society as a whole, in addition to what's coming through into the treasury. So I think there's actions that need to be taken once the whole tax code is streamlined in terms of enhancing capacity. Yes, there's a array, other stakeholders, the regulation and oversight itself, and then on the other side, the mining houses themselves, the transparency, things like the Zambia Extractive Initiative, Zambia Extractive Initiatives, the Transparency Initiative.
That's correct.
People to understand what that's all about and getting interested in the outputs of that particular study, getting it up to date, etc. And then you then hopefully then you see the results come through. So I think there's some mistakes that have been made in terms of where have we focused our attention in terms of dealing with the sector. So I think if those are addressed and we pinpoint where, if you say the mining houses are we say that they're not compliant, let's deal with their non-compliance as opposed to pass laws and regulations which then make the country unattractive. That's all.
Right. Good. So we need to pinpoint that problem and address it appropriately. Still on mining, and maybe the final question here, and I'll turn to Dr. Mwape. Mopani Copper Mines was acquired just over a year ago by government, 100% away from Glencore. This is more than 12 months on. What's your perspective? A good move? Or as some people say, there's lack of clarity on how government intends to take Mopani, and therefore people are not sure whether that was a good move or not?
Yeah, you see, I actually frown upon government involvement in private business.
Okay.
Because government is not set up to run business. Of course, as you said, it's not very clear as to the motivation, the underlying rationalizations for that move. But to the extent that the government move is transitory,
right,
and there is a pathway to getting the money back to the private sector, because I think business is best run by the private sector.
Right.
Yeah, but for the moment, it's not clear what the motivations were for that move, and then what the exit strategy is. In terms of control, yes, the government will have a hold on the resource of the entity, but the worry is that will they manage it in an appropriate way. So, in my view, there's no clarity in terms of why we took that over, and then I don't see what the exit strategy is. Right.
Quite profound. Any alternative views from either Andrew or Bernadette? Dr. Mwape, is of the view that for the mining sector, it needs to be left with the private sector. Any involvement by government must be temporary. Any alternative thoughts?
Well, I think that comes about the inefficiencies or efficiency of government personnel when it comes to running certain power stations, or rather enterprises owned by government.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think studies have been done, and you find that the CEO, a good CEO like Andrew or yourself, Daniel,
Humphrey, actually.
Rather, Humphrey from, sorry about that, coming from the private sector, you run the companies where you're from efficiently, and you bring about, maximized profits. Okay, you are given a role in government to run a government-owned enterprise, government spending agency, and suddenly what you would actually do, your performance in the private sector is higher than the one in government. I don't know what that is. So that is really still, a bone of contention. People are really trying to study, and no one has really come up with the best answers to that. But I feel that in that light, then Dr. Mwape is actually very right to say, detach yourselves as government from enterprises so that we can see the process, so that we can see the profits, so that we can see performance, best performance, and put in measures so that we can at least get what we have to get as a country. At the end of the day, it's about the country, and we have to deliver a service to the people, and we can't deliver service on empty coffers.
Right.
I mean, if I can add,
yes,
I mean, my perception obviously is driven just purely by, can only comment by what we see in the public domain.
Right.
So in the public domain, it's clear that the previous owners were if we deal with that specific case, right?
Yes.
The previous owners were in the process of placing the mine on care and maintenance,
right?
And that's what they were moving towards for whatever reasons. You start with the premise that any investor, if there's going to be a rational investor, if they've got a viable investment, they want to continue to operate it, right? So if an asset is making money for me, why would I want to shut it down? Right? So that's a question that I often ask myself when I hear these things. Right?
Yeah.
So that's part one.
Yeah.
Part two, what we've heard in the public domain, obviously there was an agreement which was entered into that does involve the government's holding company, which through which they hold investments in ZCCM. So you'd hope that in terms of how the mine is managed, at least it's not directed by government, quasi-government. That quasi-government needs to be run professionally, and that's what you hope.
Yes.
Number three, based on what we've heard as well, is the sentiment that, or the communication that this mine, in the period that it's been operating, is now generating favorable returns in terms of profitability.
Right.
Obviously, that company is subject to audit. I'm sure the year-end is here or hereabout. Unfortunately, it's not a public listed entity, but I'm sure through ZCCMIH's annual report, we will get to see what happened. How is it that what happened whereby an investor who is expected to have a high pedigree in terms of running assets thought that this mine wasn't viable. The mine is taken over. It is now generating positive returns. What has happened?
Right.
So we don't have that picture. It's possible. I mean, it happens sometimes when an auditor goes in, the picture changes quickly. So we will get to that position.
Yeah.
So those are there. They're like Dr. Mwape said, there are some questions which we don't have answers to, which make it difficult to definitively say, right? Yeah. Because on one side, care and maintenance means loss of employment.
Yes.
That employment now has not been lost.
Right.
So in the short term, that must be a positive, at least for the employees and the economy there in which those mines operate.
Yeah.
On the flip side, there's obviously questions around the agreement itself, how it's structured, and then the question, okay, so what is it that we have done that the previous investors who should, at least from what we know, have the pedigree to run such an asset, what has changed?
Right.
And then we validate it from that. But there's information, there are gaps in the information, which mean you can't completely say comment on it. I mean, the other comment, which is also in the public domain, is a strategic intent from ZCCMIH to be a majority shareholder in a large mining asset, because they found where they do not have more than a significant influence, they are not able to derive the value that they expect.
Yeah.
That in itself, I mean, there are countries, Chile and other countries, where you have state-owned conglomerates, which are run as private entities that actually then mean there's a bit more control for the local. So I think there's information on both sides of the equation. Some information we don't know, but I'm sure in time it will become a bit more apparent.
Right, so there's some gaps there.
Correct.
Right, let's move to energy. Electricity in particular, which is obviously very key for any economy. Our output has increased significantly over the years. We're currently sitting at something like 3,000 megawatts. That's the capacity that we can produce as a country because of Kafue Coach Logo, for example, Itezi, some solar power stations as well have come on stream, which is really a good story, I think. If you talk about the past few years. Dr. Mwape, would you say we are on the right path in the power sector? And are we doing enough to support all these big, bold initiatives that have been announced, say the mining sector, 3 million metric tons of copper output?
Yeah, energy is a vital ingredient to the well-being of any economy. And I think the developments you've alluded to are very, very positive. The major stakeholder in the energy sector, ZESCO, has not been doing very well. And also the impact of the lack of stability in the supply of energy has impacted the performance of the economy across the board. Whether it's SME, whether it's large scale, there's that challenge. And one of the key reasons was that the pricing of energy was not up to speed. So one of the things that has been done is basically to remove the subsidy on pricing, to make the price of electricity more competitive. And the hope, the key outcome desired from that intervention is that the energy sector will become attractive. Mm-hmm. There is also this issue of greening the globe, mm-hmm. which is attracting a lot of investment into that space.
Correct.
So in my view, the outlook is positive. The measures which have been taken will be able to attract a reasonable interest in energy, as well as also there will be need to revisit the way ZESCO, the electricity company operates.
Yes.
And the interventions which are being made there may positively impact on the supply of electricity. So we do see capacity, I think, increasing, and that's very positive for the economy.
Yes. No, you're quite right. The government has, I think, announced in public that they do intend to increase tariffs by 13% in the future, although they haven't done it yet.
I think one of the conditions aligned to the ECF, the Enhanced Credit Facility, was to basically do those things.
Yes.
Electricity, fuel, and I think fiscal.
Right. So, sort of pare down on the subsidies. Okay, very good. So that's energy. Agri sector, Bernadette. Government have made it quite clear that they intend to focus on the agri sector because of its potential to create jobs. And it's really an easy win, given we've got a lot of fertile land in Zambia, a lot of rain. What's your perspective? What do you see will happen in the agri sector in 2022?
Well, fortunately and unfortunately, the agriculture sector in Zambia, we base it so much on the rainfalls. And as we know right now, that there's been a big win from the 2020 to 2021 rainfall and farming calendar, where Zambia has recorded serious bumper harvest, such that the FRA in itself does not know what to do with the maize right now.
The largest on record, apparently, 3 million metric tons.
Yes, that's huge. That's huge, and very good for Zambia, of course. That's where we get our food from, and it also means that we will have enough food to even channel to those areas where they did not do so well across the country when it comes to redistribution of food through perhaps DMMU. This is really food also, and also exports. Obviously, we will export at some point. Gives also a big oomph to local millers. So I think in the agriculture sector, so far in the maize side, we have done very, very well. That's a big score. Going back to the initial thought that unfortunately we base so much of our agriculture sector into the maize production, I think we ought, moving forward, we ought to really look at diversifying agriculture activities. Agriculture must be looked at as a business. That's why I think there's a term from NEPAD's CADA, perhaps the Comprehensive Agriculture Program under the New Partnership for Africa's Development, where they have gotten countries to commit through certain percentages, where Zambia is expected to put in at least 10% from our GDP annually, so that we can benefit from what they can also do to our country in terms of growing our agribusiness. And they have moved from the term agriculture alone to agribusiness for a reason. And this reason is to make it as an enterprise so that it brings so much to the country through entrepreneurial activities within the agriculture sector. Agriculture sector being a major employer.
Yes.
We have known this for a very long time. I think it remains for years a major employer. 70% of employment in the public sector comes from the agriculture sector. Even when our country is actually a monotype, even up to now, a monotype of the kind of country where we get most of our GDP and proceeds from mining sector, but agriculture has still topped being the supplier of jobs, or the employer, the major employer to our people. So this is a very, very cardinal sector that really needs to be that's a sector that really needs to be looked at very well, and it can't be ignored, and progress has to also be monitored.
Yeah.
And if we can also look at aiding small-scale farmers, so that the more they produce, the more we have also. And looking at diversification, we look at crop diversification as well. If our people can go into producing soybeans at the large scale, so that we can also export. Because even when it comes to commodities, Zambia remains a huge commodity importer. We rely on importing commodities, and that's very dangerous. We saw this in times of COVID, when actually other countries were locked. We were unable to tap into other countries' commodities. And I remember very well when Bake Bridge border post had been closed, and other border posts, and this now posed a huge challenge even for us to have potatoes in our households. Yeah. It was becoming a privilege to actually have enough potatoes or onions, and you can imagine that if another calamity had to hit beyond COVID. So we do not want to go that way. So may we, as a country now moving forward, invest in crop diversification, and Zambia has very favorable weather patterns that accepts most of crops, and even going back to, I think, the Fourth Republic, where I remember the president then, I was pretty young, but I remember the president then would so much talk about winter maize, and this winter maize can actually come as in handy when the country is going low on maize production and other production areas. Yeah. But beyond that, we could also look at how energy, to just marry the energy aspect to agricultural production. We also need to diversify energy sources.
Yes.
When we look at hydropower alone, it will not sustain our economy if we have to move forward. Many a times, we look at economic indicators in isolation to say this will work well, inflation is not working well, there's an issue of currency, and then also production, the mining sector, but we forget one thing. We do not move in silos. We must never forget the real catalyst here of any production will be energy. Yeah. And energy, we look at hydro energy alone. And in hydro energy, there are a lot of these problems that Dr. Mwape has already highlighted. Problems of not having enough independent power producers. Yeah. We look at ZESCO alone as if ZESCO should just create this magic, when actually ZESCO also relies on Zambezi River Authority as a distributor from before we even talk about Zambezi Lower, which has come, or rather Kafue Gorge Lower, which has come, and the Kariba Dam. So we have all these challenges when we look at the energy sector as well, but then we have the sun. We have the sun. We must be able to move our people, the entire population, into other sources of energy. We go to Tanzania and Mozambique. If you visit households, you find that they're using a gas in their households. The hydropower is only for lighting, and also sometimes actually lighting is done by solar. Yeah. But then solar power indeed. But then hydropower is for huge industries. So you go to heavy industries there in town, in the areas where industrial activities are being done. That's where you find that's where they really require hydropower. So we need to move not on the rhetoric, not only in the national development plans, thematic areas. We need to move beyond the rhetorics of what we are saying. No, diversify. We need to now implement these things, and it can only be through energy diversification of energy sources, rather, and diversify even economic revenue sources. We grow our tax bases, then we can talk about a viable economy, because we tend to look at things in isolation and we will not.
Yeah. No, you make some important points up, Bernadette. And talking about diversifying power sources, I actually read the report just a few days ago, and they were saying something like the Earth receives enough sunlight such that the sunlight received in 1 hour can power the whole globe for a whole year. Imagine the potential that we have there.
Maybe let me just chip in on the agricultural conversation as well. For me, this conversation, I think we need to restructure a few things, right? Because we've talked about the potential, Zambia's agricultural potential for a long time. We've talked about the land capacity. Yes, we're restricted because of things like dependence on rain, etc.
Yes.
When I say what do you need in terms of structure to actually get this agricultural sector to be the future for Zambia, right? Yes, there's discussions around we need larger scale estates, we need to better support the small scale farmer. But I go all the way back to, for example, education, right? And I say to myself, today, in Zambia today, right, what is the curriculum around agriculture? Okay. If agriculture is an integral part of Zambia's future, which, for example, the very best students, we just had the exam results released, the very best students, where are they going? And what are they going to study?
Yeah.
There's a bias right now, which is a good one. Yeah. The sciences, right?
Right.
And technical stuff.
Right.
Which is a good thing. Yes. But if our very best are going to study, all of them, right, are going to study to become engineers, technology, etc., then what's happening with, or what is then the long-term prospects
for this important sector?
Very best minds are not going there. Today, Humphrey, it's an open secret. How many people are now spending their weekends doing some sort of agricultural activity?
Right.
They're learning as they're getting, it's something that they're planning to start doing in their retirement.
Yeah.
That's when they're starting to learn
and
make mistakes. when even the capital that's there is limited, because now you're looking at your pension package.
Indeed.
Can you imagine what Zambia's agricultural outlook would be if me and you, all the way from primary school, Zambia's very best minds, right? All the way from primary school, we studied agriculture as a long-term career. I mean, I don't know about you, but in our times, few people aspired to go into farming as a career after having spent time amassing all this knowledge.
Yeah.
So there is something there which, from a policy perspective and direction, all the way from education, needs to be realigned, so that all the way from whether and you identify who is interested, who are the very best, and you find a way of even incentivizing people to go into that particular field. Yeah. Because then if you couple the knowledge that you've accumulated through education, with now the practice and the relevant support after you're done with education, then you're going to end up with efficient output, where someone perceives agriculture all the way from the beginning as a real livelihood. You don't have your best all aspiring to be engineers, accountants, doctors, etc., and they're only doing this as something on the side.
As a hobby.
Yes, there are others who are doing it. I mean, why do other countries where you've got huge commercial farms, how do they do it? And I think there's something to learn there. But I think we need to, in addition to everything else that we're doing, we actually need to remodel even our education system to support this. Because that's something that over time, I mean, I've got small children, I don't think any of them is aspiring to become a farmer.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Yeah.
They're not starting to learn about farming now.
Yeah.
Why is that? Yeah. If this is our trump card for the future, then surely someone needs to start learning about it now, so that in 10, 15 years' time, they already understand it, they're already fully supported, and it's not trial and error.
Indeed. It's a profound point, and so back to basics there. Starting up education system.
That's what I mean.
Right. And just to pick up on the point that Bernadette raised, she alluded to COVID and the adverse impact on supply chains. So 2020. Well, COVID is still here, and it's an ever-present threat, even now. We're currently going through the fourth wave. It's in remission, thankfully, but it's still there. It can actually impact all these, points that we're raising from an economic perspective. Do you think government is doing enough to address this ever-present risk?
I think it's actually not just government. It's a multifaceted issue. What is the role of government? Government is communicating. Every day we have had some sort of communication. The problem when you talk about a subject for very long, I think people then start to become immune and don't listen to it. So that's the risk. But let's be honest, every day, for how long? For well over a year. Going towards 2 years, right? We've had that for. 2, the arrangements have been put in place around getting vaccines in place, which is where we are as in the evolution of the pandemic should be the focus, right? Getting people vaccinated, right? Our vaccination rates are still very, very low, right? For whatever reason, right? For various reasons, rather. So there's government is attempting to communicate, do different things to get that up. As far as I know, if anyone wants to get vaccinated today, there is no shortage of those drugs. Okay. So that is really the role of government. On the other side, and in addition to that, if you look at this year's budget, the budget allocation to the health sector, I think, is up to 3.4 billion kwacha, and a lot of that is attributed to COVID-19. And I think it's on the realization that this is one thing that can disrupt everything. Basically throw a spanner in the works. I think society as a whole, when we look at ourselves, what are we doing? Right? Obviously, corporates play part, different parts of it, and we've seen that come to the fore at different stages of the pandemic. But then vaccinations are not happening. Why is that? Right? That's obviously something that needs to be addressed. Number 2, when we see that a wave has subsided, obviously there's a desire to get back to life as normal. Getting back to life as normal is sowing the seeds for the next wave, which is exactly what has happened. You go into public spaces, you meet people who are not home, right? Can that really be put on government government shoulder the responsibility, right? So there's a role that we as society also are playing in terms of how this pandemic evolves. We hope with time that we get to a place where even now, we are where we are this year, where we are last year, in the waves, I think everyone has learned a thing or two about how to adapt, what happens.
Yeah.
You get infected, whether you're an organization or an individual, what you have to do. So all that awareness is there. But I think there's a lot more that as society we need to do, obviously, in terms of keeping it in control. The biggest part of that is meant to be the vaccination program, which we hope generates a bit more activity up to levels where it's then a bit more sustainable in terms of us going back to like a semblance of life as was normal. But we're still a bit far away, and I think if you put it sort of on a scale, it's tipping more towards have we as society and citizens done what we needed to do in response. And I think there's still plenty to be done there. Obviously, the health workers have been fantastic throughout.
Absolutely.
Even when the waves have subsided, they've still been there every single day dealing with different people. So you can only imagine the amount of stress that they've been through. So they definitely are the stars in this particular narrative, but there's still plenty to do.
It's a multifaceted problem, not just the government, for all of us, even at the individual level. Thanks, Andrew. CDF, and I think you did allude to this, Dr. Mwape. Maybe let's spend a bit of time here, because this is one area where government increased funding significantly, from 1.6 million per constituency to over 25 million per constituency. Do you think that's a good move, or do you see risks in that substantial increase?
Yeah, well, there are positives as well as negatives. As I indicated earlier, that the challenge we've had in delivering development, particularly inclusive development, has been a management challenge. It's not that Zambia has never had resources. Zambia's economy has grown very well before, but the distributional aspect of it has been a challenge. So for me, the first take is that the increase in the allocation of funds to the CDF, it actually takes money across the country.
Right.
Yes, there will be successes and there will be failures. Some constituencies will manage that fund very well and they will have very positives coming out of it. Others may fail. But what's important is that the failures over time are going to learn for those who will succeed. And more importantly, that money is going to have a very positive impact on the economic dynamics of the local economy in those areas. The issues of job creation, the issues of gender, poverty, alleviation, etc., we start seeing those activities impacting in a very widespread way. So the question of inclusiveness starts being addressed. So to me, that's the real major takeaway. So I see it as a very positive move. I see it as starting to deliver the inclusiveness that we always desired, and I see a widespread impact in terms of the welfare of particularly the rural community.
Right. Would you agree, Bernadette?
Oh, yes, I agree totally. But one thing we must understand that I feel as a citizenry may not have understood. Perhaps I can call it information asymmetry here, is that the CDF funds, or rather the CDF itself, being increased in the manner it has, means that it takes away from central government performing certain developmental services, if I may put it in that way.
Right.
it's not that the central government will continue performing or advancing certain developmental agendas on its own. It's in light to respond to the fact that now we have a decentralization and devolution policy in place and we would like it to be implemented. Instead of, I was just talking about rhetorics, that we must move away from talk. And this government, I think, in responding to this, to bringing decentralization, to making community bearers being able to participate in developmental matters on community levels, had to happen only in this light when the CDF had been increased.
Yeah, right.
So it's not necessarily that there's a whole lot of a new budget that has been put towards CDF alone. And then the central government has been left with the continuous mandate that was there before to tackle some developmental activities.
Yeah.
No, it's the whole shift. So this money shifts from central government and then it's put in CDF so that communities through municipality gain to own the development and distribute these developmental activities. And in that light, have community bearers, which are you and I, to participate in this community developmental activities. I don't know if I'm making sense in that light.
No, we hear you.
So having said that, it means that it calls for municipalities or councils to be at par, at excellent service to its people through these activities. Otherwise we have a risk of having serious disparities in developmental activities and achievements from community to community, depending on our own perhaps mindset when it comes to work ethics, for example. And also looking at the positives though, let me not look at the risk side. The positives is that we have an opportunity to engage women and youths in our developmental activities as a country, starting in our community levels. And when we begin at community levels, it also means that our local businesses, our SMEs, have a chance to actually participate fully and take on businesses through these local municipalities. And beyond that, it means that it will be a collective thing when it comes to development. And that way, then we are heeding also to aspirations of not the 8th National Development Plan, but the previous one, where we are talking about owning the development together when it comes to development plans so that we can move forward. So CDF brings or poses this challenge, but it's a positive challenge for also posterity.
No, indeed. And just to close out, and maybe I'll turn to Andrew, still on CDF. I mean, the increase is quite substantial, clearly. Should government be wary of anything in terms of transparency and accountability, given what we see in the Auditor General reports and so on, and the funding is now going to the constituencies?
Certainly. It goes without saying that there's a significant, I think I'm not sure if the guidelines had been issued as yet. So it's a work in progress, right? So transparency, accountability, definitely, right? Because have those parts of the government managed such resources in the past? The answer is probably no. Right. How will they deal with it? What you hope to see is what we expect to see rather is a lot of learning the first 2 or so years. And they're going to be findings in the Auditor General's report, guaranteed, without doubt. And we would hope that not just the Auditor General, internal audit, everyone is paying particular attention. Right. Because like Bernadette said, certain services, if the CDF doesn't cater for it, or if you're not diligent in how you do it, then nobody's going to deal with it. The central government is not going to intervene. So that goes without saying.
Indeed.
I'm pretty sure that the government is alive to that challenge, and so the structures, the systems is key. The opportunity, obviously, is things like digital transformation of government, whenever that happens or how that happens, as an opportunity to increase that accountability and transparency. There's also an opportunity to say, so I'm pretty sure the whole amount is not being dispersed at the same time. So some sort of a balanced scorecard or ongoing assessment where disbursements are actually dependent on achievements that you've delivered in the past. So you may have received your first tranche, but how well are you? How well have you performed? How accountable are you before your next tranche is dispersed? And because what actually fosters the accountability is the interest from the citizen. And I think that's why decentralization of government is key.
Indeed.
Because the citizen takes an interest. MP, we haven't received our second tranche. What's the problem? Right? So and so hasn't provided this particular information for us to submit this report or this return so that we get our next allocation. So what's the problem? Where is it? So you then have that pressure right from the community itself for transparency and accountability. Then it's sustainable. And hopefully as well, is that if the community themselves are the ones who are selecting the party that will do a certain piece of work, they're the ones who are approving the budgets, etc., and they will hold each other to account. You won't have situations of the contractor came, mobilized, demobilized, disappeared, we've never seen them. They will know he lives around the block.
Absolutely.
Sir, we've given you a job, where's the problem? So it's that sort of interest, especially from the community, coupled with that oversight from the center, which I think will then foster that. But we expect that there will be quite a bit of learning in the process. And I think what's important is that when we look at it year on year, we want to see improvements, not repeats of the same mistakes. Because what the real risk here is that you've simply decentralized efficiency or decentralized corruption, or whatever it is. And when you multiply that out, you might actually find that the cost is greater than when it was being done centrally. And the real control is that community oversight and interest that the community takes. Because that pressure then will hopefully keep everyone alive.
Indeed. So, some final thoughts. I'll just go round the room now. Maybe for 2-3 minutes you can each speak. And what I would like you to cover as you give your final thoughts is what you think were the major wins and losses in 2021 from an economic perspective. Maybe just one each if you can find those. But secondly, if you had the power, for example, if you were the Minister of Finance, what would you change about our monetary policy or fiscal policy to make things work better? I'll start with Dr. Mark, final thoughts.
Well, for me, in terms of the major wins for 2021, I would say the IMF agreement.
Right.
Because what that does, it gives us an opportunity to commence discussions on debt restructuring, and it also creates a real opportunity, of course, uniting those discussions and releasing relief on the fiscal space.
Right.
So, and that has a baseline implication on what happens to the economy going forward.
Yes.
So for me, that was a huge success.
Right.
In terms of what I would do in terms of monetary policy, in my view, the current monetary policy stance, I won't really disturb it.
Right.
What has happened is that between, I think from the advent of COVID, the central bank focus has not necessarily been to contain inflation, but it has been posturing and a very accommodative monetary policy stance.
Right.
Because of the inherent challenges that COVID introduced to, say, financial sector stability.
Yeah.
So they were more concerned with the stability of the financial sector rather than bringing inflation down.
Mm-hmm.
Now that stability is creeping in,
Mm-hmm.
and the numbers are looking okay, they are reverting basically to normalize the monetary policy stance. And I do see them adjust the they will be pursuing a very strict monetary policy going forward.
Right.
And I see modest adjustments in the policy rate upwards until we are close to or attain the 6 to 8% inflation target band.
Right.
So I think the current policy stance is okay. Government, the talk in terms of reducing the fiscal deficit, the discipline that is being introduced, I feel the thinking at the moment is aligned to what I would do.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mwape. Bernadette, in terms of major wins and losses for last year, but also anything you change in terms of policy, whether monetary or fiscal?
Yes, in terms of the major win and moving away from slightly the major economies, I think I would talk about the containing of the COVID-19 in 2021, which threatened to cripple the health sector
Indeed.
and cripple the entire economy.
Right.
So I think containing it in the manner that we did, even having gone through a lot of losses in terms of life losses, business losses, etc., we were able to come out alive and as a country stronger. And now we know what to do, where to touch. And I think kudos to the government throughout the COVID-19 pandemic since it came. I wouldn't call it inception, but since it began.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, I think that was a major win, containing it, and also government through different interventions and incentives through the central bank and other partners coming through for SMEs in one way or another. I think that too. Also, kind of the think tanks' response also to providing research and development in that area and in that light at a time of heightened, perhaps very dangerous waves. I think that too was a major win. We saw why think tanks are actually available. What would I do? Zambia remains a commodity-dependent economy. I feel that if I concentrated on policies that would actually get the country out of this dependency to a more productive country in all sectors, be it health sector, education, mining, especially through the SMEs as well, I think that would be a road to the country's economic recovery at par.
Right.
And that's what I would concentrate on. And in a nutshell, that's basically everything.
Indeed.
So having said that, also looking at the introduction of the Ministry of Small and Medium Scale Enterprises, that's a very good trajectory that will actually is an indicator of seriousness in terms of responding to our economic needs at the moment, especially that Zambia is a youthful country. Looking at statistics, in 2017 alone, over 54% of the population were under 17 years. So you can imagine how youthful this population is. I haven't looked at the statistics today, as of today, but I know that we are a youthful country, and only youthful responses to everything that we do in an economy will actually give a life to the future economy of Zambia. So I think in that light, and also responding to the Africa Free Trade Area, Continental Free Trade Area, and how you can actually perhaps position ourselves as a country to getting the most of what we can get from this initiative in terms of trade and in terms of commerce, and where we can can see it as a country and improving ourselves in that light, which gives also room for women and young people to thrive economically. So I think that's what I would do.
No, very helpful indeed. So rather than just producing commodities, adding value, as you said, Bernadette, really important to create jobs, but also responding appropriately to the free African free trade area, which would be a risk if we're not all poised to respond to that. Andrew, your final word covering those points?
Yeah, look, I think incrementally, right? I mean, Dr. Mwape has spoken about IMF, Bernadette has spoken about COVID containment.
Yes.
On the positive side, I think really it's tone, right?
Yes.
Tone, especially post-election, around direction of the country, obviously supported by the budget statement. I think that was a big win. The budget is loaded in terms of its intent for all sectors, for entrepreneurs, for SMEs, for individuals, you name it, for the mining sector, the agri sector, manufacturing, import sector. There's a lot in that statement, which I think should give most businesses some cause for optimism. And I think that, coupled with the general positive sentiment post-elections, has had significant benefit on the country. Inflows, investor sentiment, you name it. The tone, especially even around things like corruption. You've seen what has happened with the donor community in terms of coming forward to support various initiatives. So I think that is a big plus. Loss, I think, is the flip side of what Bernadette said, so the COVID impacts, right? So contained, yes, people impact relative to other countries contained, but there has been impact on society and business as large. When I think of, for example, the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, which is supposed to be a major, it was already a major contributor. When you see how much strain they've gone through in the last few years, you can't help but obviously spare thought for that particular sector. So I think that sector, given how it was positioned to contribute to the country, I think there's obviously been an opportunity cost there, which is huge. It's not just Zambia. When I look forward in terms of what things to do differently, I think on the fiscal side, especially around government borrowing, that's fundamental because you look at what is done to the cost of funding, the crowding out effect as it's known. I think if we taper that back, then brings a bit more stability into the financial system and sector, which then supports the rest of the sectors in terms of those wishing to access finance and even those who have finance, that finance becoming cheaper. There's obviously a big milestone that all this hinges on, if you ask me, and that is the conclusion of debt renegotiation. Well, there's a lot that we don't know.
Right.
What will that renegotiate? What will that package look like after it's renegotiated? I think once that is done, then a lot of other things then start falling into place. Right? It gives some relief for pain caused by subsidies, etc., etc. But that's what I would say. Wins, the tone, losses, impact of COVID, what I'll do differently, fiscal, especially borrow, in terms of making sure we keep that contained. More important, we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. If you're borrowing, it has to be for productive activity, it has to be a project that can pay for itself, those types of conversations.
Indeed.
I think are quite key. So we have to have learned some lessons. We can't repeat the lessons of the past.
Absolutely. On that point, keeping debt in check and under control, we come to the end of the discussion. Thank you to all the listeners, and a big thank you to the Amcham for organizing this event. Thank you very much to the panelists, and of course to Lecture 15 for giving us this COVID-compliant venue. Have a great morning. Thank you.
Today tastes like a new tradition, like an old favorite. Tastes like all hands on deck and all eyes on the prize. Today tastes like a piece of the action. And it never tasted this good. The day the world stopped was the day we found where to go. From now on, we are not going to leave anything on our plates, because we've learned to savor the moments that were always there, and they never tasted this good.